when we would go to visit my grandma Hinckley, everybody would come to see us because we were the ones that lived far away. And at that point in time, everybody lived in the New England area. And so that meant when we went to sit down to have dinner, chairs were very important because my dad had 7 brothers and sisters and their spouses and their kids, 26 of us. So the adults got the big table first, and then because the age range of grandkids was very great, the oldest grandkids would be able to fill in the seats that were left at the big table, and then there were the rest of us at the other table. Now, at that table, it was always important to keep my dad away from my Aunt Ginny and my Aunt Thelma, because his role in life as the middle child was to torture them as much as he could, starting arguments about politics or whatever he knew would set either of them off. So they would try to keep one or the other at the other end of the table. But there was always something missing at the table, because family dynamics are complicated sometimes. And my dad's oldest brother was killed in his 30s. And because of that, his wife was widowed and married my grandmother's brother, causing much complication in the family, especially from my grandmother, who was not very pleasant to my Aunt Madeline. So Aunt Madeline wasn't usually invited to the table. She had no place there. The kids came to the dinner, but one person was left out. How do we think about who gets invited to the table? Who's welcomed? Who's wanted? Who has a place? And where do you want your place to be? Because let me tell you, as I got older and I moved to my grandmother's house to go to graduate school in Connecticut, go Yukon Huskies, we're in the Final 8. As I moved there, people would come to visit, but they had a regular pattern. So around Grandma's table, me and Uncle Miller, the one who married my Aunt Madeline, would play canasta. But there were times when the family gathered, usually during the summer for the family reunion. And at the family reunion, it was a whole crew at the original family church in Lebanon. But when they gathered at the table, as I was now an adult, I could sit at the big table, but I chose the kids' table because my aunts and uncles were still arguing about politics. And it was more fun to sit with now the grandkids who were having kids. The table can be a complicated place. How many of us have had experience of tables being complicated? Remember being in middle school or high school, and you're going through the lunch line, and then you have to choose a place to sit. How many of us have felt left out in that moment, not knowing which table will be safe, which table will be okay to sit at, which table will you not be rejected at? How many of us have had table experiences that have had profound consequences for us? That first bit of jello or broth that you get to take after you've had surgery, and the smile on the person who brought it to you. That cup of coffee that was given to you at the coffee house, even though you didn't have the change to pay. tables can be complicated. They can be a place of welcome and hope, and they can be a place of pain and separation. And so in our story today from the gospel, it begins in verse 1 with Jesus invited to eat with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are that group of people, Jesus is a Pharisee, who argue with each other over the best way to practice faith. And this time, as the Pharisee invites him to dinner on the Sabbath, and a Sabbath invitation, that is special. My friends when I lived in Wyoming, there were a group of us pastors who would get together because the regular pastors group could be complicated when we gathered at the table. Because half of the group didn't think that the 6 of us women were actually pastors and called by God. So we gathered at a coffee shop most weeks to talk about life and faith. And one of us at that table was the cantor at the Jewish temple across the street from the coffee house. But the Jewish temple went through a family dispute. And the cantor had to choose what to do at that point. I mean, and in Wyoming, there aren't a lot of options for you to choose, and they're all 4 or 5 hours away. So our friend decided to start a new temple, and she needed people. And so as pastors would go to hear the service, and she led. But she'd also give us invitations to Sabbath dinner, to break the bread and drink the wine with her on the holiest night of the week for Jewish people, where they would light the candles, they would say the prayers, and they would share a meal. And she'd also invite us to the Passover dinner, which she had a deal with the person who started a farm-to-table restaurant in the mall in Casper. So up there in the empty mall at night, we shared this Sabbath meal. Now, the Seder. Now, I will admit, as a vegetarian, it's very complicated to eat. But that wasn't the point. The point was to hear the story. To hear the story of the Exodus. To hear the story of the people who needed their freedom. To sit around that table and share that powerful message. And the thing I learned that night is you drink a glass of wine in between each section. So you have to be careful about how much wine you're drinking. But it was this powerful experience of eating at that table with all these people, because her table was open to all of us. We were invited, all these female pastors and their families, to come and eat and share. So Jesus is invited to a Sabbath dinner. He's invited to this dinner that the Pharisees are holding because he is, at this point in time, the person you want to get to come to your table, especially if you're a Pharisee, because he's enlivening all of you. He's shaking everything up and getting him. That is like the prime thing you want, right? And so they invite him to dinner. But it says, before this whole episode started, that some of them were there to challenge him and confront him and make him do something that he shouldn't do. So there, on the Sabbath, on the way to dinner, was a man placed in front of him who needed to be healed. And Jesus always works from his heart, looks at others with compassion, and heals that man. And then they get inside, and Jesus watches what happens as people move around the table and who's invited to the big people's table and the little people's table and the one way in the back where you can't hear what's going on. And he watches how people are seated, noticing, and he keeps it in the back of his head, the man with dropsy wasn't invited. The one who was now free and healed and whole was not in that invitation to dinner. And so it being Jesus, he decides, I'll tell you a parable. Meaning that nobody's going to understand what comes next because you can understand it however you hear it, right? Like the part that is important to you, that you need to hear that day, is the part of the parable that says that to you. And so he looks around as people are sitting, and he remembers this passage from Proverbs that says, do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told to come up here than to be put lower in the presence of the noble. So Jesus takes that passage of Proverbs and thinks, I see that happening here. Granted, it's not kings, but they're trying to decide who belongs and who belongs in the place of honor. And Jesus tells them, when you're invited to dinner, I want you to go to that table, the one where you can barely hear what's going on, the one farthest away from the good food and the good wine. I want you to go sit there. And let that person invite you to come close, come up. I want you to be humble. I want you to practice humility. Don't choose for yourself the honor that you think you deserve, but let the invitation come. But he knows that's not a complete answer to what he sees happening, right? Because he had noticed that the man that he had healed is not there and not at the table. So he tells the second parable. The parable that shares, who should you invite to your banquet? Don't invite those who are wealthy and powerful. Don't invite just your friends and your relatives and the neighbors that can invite you back because they have the best. I want you to go out in the streets and invite those who aren't normally welcome. And so he gives a list. But the list is made to make you think about who isn't present at the table. Who is it that we leave out? Who is it that isn't invited? Who is it that wouldn't be even allowed at that table way in the back? They had to go to the kitchen door and beg for scraps. He says those people, the ones who have to beg for scraps, they're the ones you need to invite to the table. So you know how I always like to bring this into the present order, right? I want you to think about this in terms of DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right now, we are arguing over who's invited to the table. who has a place. And now I will say, because I'm UCC, and UCC from ancestors for hundreds of years, that the thing that made me UCC was that list of firsts. I don't know if you've ever seen it on the website, but the list of the things that the United Church of Christ, even in its predecessor denominations, did before anybody else. That list is why I'm UCC. The list that says we are the first church to ordain a woman, the first church to ordain a gay person, the first church to ordain a trans person, here in California, by the way, the first church to start the fight against slavery, the first church to welcome a boatload of slaves who revolted against their slaveholders and give them a place to live. The first church that said the world could be different and then worked on issue after issue to make it different. The first church that did the first environmental report that said we place toxic waste and plants that pollute, anything that can harm your body and will cause harm to your body, we place those places in communities of color. Our church is the first church that made that connection and published a report that it is cited in every paper that talks about toxic waste and race. That's why I became United Church of Christ. Because even though our church, is unusual, because the majority of churches in the United Church of Christ are divided by race and color and ethnicity. Even though the majority of churches are white, we want to be better and different. We want a world where everyone is at the table together, sharing food, trying food that I had never had before, because in the cornfields of Illinois, there are not any Filipino dishes or Samoan dishes. But that food, that taste of each other's culture, brings us closer, brings us together, creates that table that says the place of honor is that we're all in this together. And so when I look at the world and see colleges saying that they are no longer going to support DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think of how that got me into, made me become the person I am. That it was the diversity program. At that point in time, it wasn't called gender studies, it was called women's studies. And it was the first time I read the Bible, and somebody said, you know, there are women in there. And you know that these words that say that God is He are a translator's choice, not an actuality. That told me that those clobber passages that say gay people aren't wanted inserted the word homosexuality in 1954. It was in those classes, in that diversity class, that I read for the first time Bell Hooks and Alice Walker. That I heard for the first time, and my heart broke open as I read Toni Morrison's Bluest Eyes, and a child was hurt beyond measure in that story. That diversity and equity and inclusion changes your being because it makes you see the world through other people's eyes. And when people say to you, because they're saying it now, out loud, that DEI is not needed, not wanted, remember those stories. Remember that that is how you learned that the Little Mermaid could be black. And it was okay. That is how you learn that the disciples, even though there were 12 of them, couldn't get anything done without Luke chapter 8, 1 through 3. The women who provided the food and the money to make it happen. That diversity, equity, inclusion brought out those flavors that we don't normally see. And in stories today, where Jesus talks about being invited to the table and inviting people to the table, that's DEI. Jesus is saying, who have you left out? I want you to give them a place of honor. I want you to give them the grace to say that you are welcome here at this table with us. Jesus invites us into a kingdom where it doesn't matter what your skin color is, your ethnicity. What's important is that God created you in the image of God and loves you no matter what. And it gives you forgiveness and grace and mercy and welcome at the table. Amen.